Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. Today I'm continuing with my discussion on the Grimke family and their work the abolitionist movement and, of course, women's rights movements. They were pioneers, and I've started, I'd already discussed the prominent Grimke family of South Carolina. They were a very wealthy planter family. They were owning, and but two remarkable daughters of the Grimke family would go on to be very significant abolitionists and uh, women and leaders of the women's rights movement. That's Sarah Moore Grimke and her younger sister Angelina Grimke, who married another abolitionist, very prominent abolitionist by the name of Theodore uh, Theodore Dwight uh, Weld. Now, importantly, three of them would author a very important seminal work on abolition, and in fact, that work would influence the very famous novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. We all know of Uncle Tom's Cabin, at least we know the epithet Uncle Tom, which is, of course, derived from that very famous book. So, uh, the name of the book that they co authored is called uh, American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of a Thousand Witnesses. That's American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of a Thousand Witnesses. Today, what I want to do is discuss the uh, the African American side of the Grimke family. So, um, John Fauchereau Grimke, who had been uh, a Revolutionary War veteran, he had been a congressman, he had been uh, uh, sorry, had been a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. He'd been Speaker of the House of Representatives of South Carolina. He'd been a mayor. He was a judge. He was many things. He was a Princeton graduate. He was a Cambridge graduate, of course. And very important, and he'd married into a very prominent family as well, the descendant of a governor of South Carolina, that's Thomas More, and she was also the descendant of a baron. He'd been a baron. That's Thomas More. He'd been an English baron. So importantly, they were owning in South Carolina. Now their son Henry W. Grimke would go off to Yale. He studied at Yale. Yale was a status symbol for uh, Southern planters then. They liked to send their sons to Yale. So Yale was, yeah, was a school of choice for Southern planters. Um, so Henry W. Grimke married and he had some children. However, his wife died early, and when she died, he had a female slave, an African slave by the name of Nancy Weston, and he took her as his common law wife. Of course, there were anti-miscegenation laws, there were strict laws. There was the law of partus sequitur ventrum. So any children that the a female slave had were automatically slaves as well. In South Carolina, they had these stringent laws that prohibited manumission. Manumission was when a slave owner privately, individually frees his slaves. And also, they passed another severe law in 1841 to make sure that slave owners who had children from their slaves could not somehow free them through trust, so they couldn't pass any money, any wealth to their descendants that were slaves. So that was the idea, because even if they didn't feel, if for instance they could get work around the manumission by just bequeathing their estates to them, or significant portion of their wealth, and the person can live off that could live off that estate. So South Carolina, you know, blocked that loophole by making sure that uh, there could be no trust, that slaves could not be put inside the trust. They couldn't receive anything, no inheritance, and they couldn't receive their freedom. Nothing that would give them any legal rights through trust. So what happened was when Henry 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 W. Grimke, he would go on to live with his, um, with his female slave, who turned out whom he treated like his common law partner, as a common law wife, even though it was not legally recognized. And so he taught her to read and write. That was illegal. He would teach the children. She gave him three children. Two were born while he was alive. The third she was pregnant with at the time, when he died. So in his will, though, he he requested that his heir, well, that's Montague Grimke, that his heir should treat all of them, like members of his family. However, Montague didn't do, he didn't accede to the request of his father, his late father. So instead, he took his half brothers, who were, enslaved. He took them in as servants in his house, as domestic servants. Now he would eventually sell them off. He'd sell Francis off for what he called insubordination, and he would attempt to sell um, Archibald as well. But fortunately for them, the Civil War started, and Archibald ran away. So they were treated as domestic servants um, by Montague, by their half brother. Montague, however, he sold Francis off. He sold Francis off to someone, and by the time he got around to selling off Archibald ran away, and of course the Civil War had commenced, and he sought refuge among some relatives until the Civil War was over. They were taken in and helped by some uh, abolitionist ministers. They're called the Pillsbury Brothers. They were ministers and prominent abolitionists. They noticed the intelligence of the two brothers, and so they raised funds for them to go and study at a freedmen's school. So they studied at a freedmen's school, and they went off. By the way, the father had been teaching them how to read and write. He'd been teaching them while he was alive. That's Henry W. Grimke, because he'd moved to an estate far away from Charleston, about 25 miles away from uh, Charleston, and so he could live as a family with his female slave and their children, away from the inquisitive eyes of and the prying eyes of white Charleston society. But once he was deceased, of course, that fell off, right? But now the Pillsbury brothers would now raise funds to help them study at a freedmen's school, and eventually they would go off to Lincoln University, which was an African American school. And by this time, when they were at Lincoln University, the two Grimke sisters, who hated slavery, of course, they gave away, they left South Carolina forever because they found slavery to be abhorrent, and they became passionate abolitionists. So when they discovered that, they learned of them, right? They went to look for them, and then when they found them, they supported their education financially. And of course, Archibald would go on to Harvard Law School. He became the second African American to graduate from Harvard Law School. He was, deemed very bright, very intelligent. Uh, Francis Francis would graduate from Princeton Theological Seminary, and he would go on to become one of the most prominent clergymen in his era. He was a Presbyterian minister, became one of the most prominent African American clergymen in America during his era. Um, of course, Archibald Archibald would set up a law practice in Boston after he graduated from Harvard Law School. He was very active in the women's rights movement. He joined the activities of his aunts. He grew close to them because they took him in as a member of the family, and he was elected. And I guess it was because of them that he was elected president of the Massachusetts Women Suffrage Association. So he became president, of course, which was unusual since he was a man, but he was president of the Massachusetts Women Suffrage Association. He was very active in the NAACP as well. He became in its founding, and so was his brother. He became vice president of the national NAACP. Of course, NAACP is the foremost civil rights organization in America, founded by Webb Du Bois. Of course, Webb Du Bois, another graduate of Harvard University, he got his PhD from Harvard. He went on to teach at Howard University. He was also he lived in Massachusetts. He was from Massachusetts. But so Archibald Grimke, of course, advocated for um, equal rights for blacks. This was the era when there was a rivalry between Booker T. Washington and Webb Du Bois. Of course, Booker T. Washington advocated for blacks to not seek equal rights. That means, not to uh, express, um, political rights. So and it was around this time that, of course, Jim Crow came up in the South, and so disenfranchising black men. So um, Webb Du Bois, on the other hand, advocated for equal rights, immediate equal rights, and he advocated for what was called the training of a talented tenth, the development of a talented tenth. Sounds very elitist, but there were many millions of newly freed uh, African Americans who didn't have an education, who didn't have a leg up. They didn't have the opportunities that people like Webb Du Bois uh, and Archibald Grimke had. Of course, now in their story, you can notice the disparities in opportunities, right? So there's even already this hierarchy within blackness. Even though there was a one drop rule, everybody, once you were black in the South, everybody was enslaved, was deemed a slave, right? Even if their father was a whitey, was a wealthy, sorry, was a wealthy white person, wealthy white person, they were still slaves, just like um, Archibald and Francis. They were slaves, but their treatment was different, right? They were owned by their father, white father, but he acknowledged them as his children, even though the law did not recognize that, and he gave them a training. And now the wealthy sisters, that's the Grimke sisters, supported their activities, right? So not for the most part, majority of the freed uh, Black Americans did not have this sort of access or opportunity, right? So you can see the disparity in the opportunities that uh, Black people already had. The closer their proximity to whiteness, that's a white relative, then the more opportunities they had, like Archibald Grimke and Webb Du Bois. Um, and even Frederick Douglass, right? Frederick Douglass, his slave owning father never acknowledged him, never gave him opportunities. Frederick Douglass went on to marry a white woman, and but he had been favored. He was taught how to read and write while he was a slave, but and of course he escaped. Now, interestingly, um, Archibald Archibald Grimke himself went on to marry a white woman. She was a white woman, Nancy. She was Nancy Stanley. No, sorry, her name was not Nancy. Um, I think her name was Sarah. Yeah, probably Sarah. Um, yeah, but anyway, I think Stanley was her last name. But anyway, she was. I will correct that. Anyway, but she was from a middle class family in the Midwest, and so they married. However, the marriage did not last. They were divorced after 2 years because there was a lot of hostility, antagonism from her family, and so they gave birth to a daughter by the name of they named her Angelina Weld, Angelina Weld, after uh, um, Archibald's aunt, right, the abolitionist, who was Angelina Grimke Weld. So he named his daughter Angelina Weld Grimke. The mother took her away with her after the divorce to live in the Midwest for a bit. However, when the daughter turned 7, she brought her back and left her with the father, that's Archibald Grimke. But she committed suicide soon after. So Archibald Grimke raised her himself, raised Angelina Weld Grimke, who was, of course, she was 3/4 white. She could have passed if she wanted to, but she didn't. She identified as a black person, right? And she went on to become a prominent writer, author, uh, artist in the Harlem Renaissance, right? I took a course at Columbia University in the Harlem Renaissance, so she was a prominent feature. She wrote one of the earliest anti-lynching and racial violence plays named Rachel. It's called Rachel, and she was one of the first. She wrote amongst the earliest poems on lesbianism. So she herself was a lesbian. In fact, she had wanted to marry a woman her father, forbade her, and so she never married. She graduated from Wellesley and she took courses from her father's alma mater, that's Harvard University. So she took many courses and, she became a teacher, a writer, she was an author, and she never married. When her father eventually fell sick, she nursed him. He died in his 80s, and she nursed him. Eventually, though, she, lived in New York. She died in um, Upper West Side in New York in an apartment. She became a recluse. She sort of lived like a recluse, and she she lived into her 70s and passed in Upper West Side in New York. Of course, that area, uh, that was prominent during the era of the Harlem Renaissance. New York, the Harlem Renaissance, of course, was in New York, and that was within the proximity, that was within the vicinity of the flourishing of the Harlem Renaissance. So that's the Grimke, uh, the African American side of the Grimke family. As I said, Archibald Grimke went on to have, he flourished, he had a very successful professional life. He also worked as a public servant, serving as consul to the Dominican Republic, and he was a prolific writer on abolition and equal rights. Equal rights, he was advocate. So of course there was abolition. He was still a kid, but on equal rights and on the movement. He was a strong critic of Woodrow Wilson when Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal civil service, when he segregated the federal government. And he wrote prominently on this. He had initially been a Republican, but he went on to switch his party affiliation. Um, Francis, of course, as I said, was very prominent as a clergyman, and their youngest brother went back and lived in South Carolina. He wasn't as prominent as the other two. So that's the African American side of uh, the Grimke family. By the way, I was going to mention that um, Archibald, in addition to being the national vice president of the NAACP, that's National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Um, he also served as vice president of he served as president of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the NAACP. And he continued to serve in many other organizations. He was president of the African American Academy. He was prominent. He received so many awards during his lifetime. He was very active um, for equal rights for blacks and whites. He wanted equal rights, and he was very advocate. He was a very passionate advocate and activist in the women's rights suffrage movement. My name is Olurotimi. I'll stop here and I'll continue with discussing the women's rights movement with the Grimke family, the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who were pioneering abolitionists and feminists. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.